greatly appreciated for allowing us to Zoom through the Pat Conroy Center. Next month, our guest author is going to be Kathleen Rogers, and she's accepted our invitation to be here and discuss The Flying Cutterbucks. I have to say that slowly. Hope to see you here next month. And now I'd like to say a little bit about our guest author tonight. Judith Little grew up in Virginia and earned a Bachelor of Arts in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. After a brief time studying in France and interning at the U.S. Department of State, she earned her law degree from the University of Virginia School of Law. She now lives with her husband and 3 children in Texas. Her latest book, The Chanel Sisters, is a historical fiction novel featuring the Chanel sisters and is told from the perspective of the younger sister, Antoinette, from the time they are placed in a convent orphanage until her death in 1921. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. You are so welcome. And the floor is yours.
Okay, so do you want me to just talk about the book, or y'all ask questions, or I can talk forever, so.
You can, why don't you just talk, and then I'm sure we all have questions.
Okay. Well, let me ask, because I don't want to, it depends on if you've read it or not, if I give any spoilers. So I'll keep my mouth shut on certain things. So
I think you should go ahead and say whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I can give spoilers. Okay. Well, so, all right. So first of all, this is like you said, my second book. And I decided to write this one because I was really intrigued once I learned that Coco had a younger sister. In particular, she had 2 sisters, but Antoinette, the younger sister, really, for some reason, I was interested in her. I only have brothers. I don't have any sisters. And so I had just always wondered anyway what it would be like to have a sister. And of course, I always imagined if I did have one, she would be the perfect older sister and would let me wear her clothes and all that kind of thing. And so then when I read that Coco had a younger sister, I wondered what would it have been like to be the sister of Coco Chanel. And I figured there has to be some kind of story there. I didn't know what it would be, but it seemed like there had to be something. So I did research and tried to find what I could about Antoinette, although there's not as much known about her, not nearly as much known about her as there is about Coco. But one thing I found interesting was that, there are so many books written about Coco, fiction or nonfiction, but there are none written from the point of view of her sister. And I also wanted to write about their childhood, because that was another thing that surprised me. I had always thought that Coco Chanel was born in Paris to a wealthy family and that she came out of the womb with a strand of pearls around her neck, basically. But, the exact opposite was true. She was born in a poorhouse and her parents weren't married. Her father was a traveling peddler. They were vagabonds, really. They didn't have a home to call their own and went from place to place, usually with her mother chasing after the father, who was always seeming to run away. And then by her early 30s, Coco's mother died. Coco was 11, Antoinette was about 7, and that was when their father abandoned them on the doorstep of a convent orphanage in Avazine, which was very rural and mountainous, and that changed their lives forever, just going from, the kind of the chaos of poverty and hunger and not really knowing, where your next meal would come from or if you'd have a roof over your head, to the extreme structure of a convent orphanage. And the fact that so much of that, of her early life, her father's abandonment, her mother's death, and the life in the convent, there's so many implications for her later life. And she lied about her past. She never told the truth about her convent orphanage upbringing. But she left all these clues about it everywhere. So it's almost funny. It's so obvious if you know what you're looking for. And so that's another reason I was interested in writing about her early life. And I think one of the reasons, I think the main reason she lied about her past was because she didn't want people to know that her father had abandoned her. That was, I think, one of the most defining moments of things that had happened to her in her life. And she could never talk about it, and made up a story that she was raised by aunts in the countryside. So instead of making up a glamorous story, she still made up a story that wasn't, really particularly glamorous at all, which I found interesting because that, again, told me that it was the orphanage part that she was really trying to keep secret. And so the novel ends in 1921. So it is kind of the rags to riches story of the two of them pulling themselves up out of poverty. And it ends when Chanel is rich and famous finally. The ups and downs of them. Other things I found interesting too in their struggle to get out of poverty. There were a lot of things, but at that time in France and probably other places too, the only way for women in their socioeconomic level, which was pretty much at the bottom, to rise up out of that was to either become the mistress of a wealthy man and collect all the jewels he possibly could as sort of a 401k plan, which a lot of the mistresses did, but some of them had the discipline to, save and for later, and some didn't. And then the other way was to become a star of the stage. And Coco wanted to be on the stage. And so and part of that, I think, is because that would get her the adoration and attention she never got from her father or her family. But as you know, if you've read the book, that did not pan out for her. And she tried the other way, which was being a mistress of a wealthy man. And she basically got bored doing that as well, and realized that at some point he would get bored with her. So that was when she started selling hats, kind of because she really had failed at everything else she had tried to do. And it wasn't her, lifelong desire to be a fashion designer at all. It just ended up being what she was good at and what would support her. And until she was in her 80s and she was still taking singing lessons. I think she still held on to that dream of becoming someone, a star of the stage, and getting that recognition and the adoration that she was always seeking. So to write from Antoinette's point of view, though, I did, so I had to do a lot of research. The biographies of Coco, they don't say a lot about Antoinette. There's only certain things that they all uniformly cover. And so they say that Antoinette was pretty and that she was lively and she was a hard worker, but she wasn't as smart as Coco, and that she wasn't as resilient as Coco. And they have her at the convent orphanage in Aubazine. And then she is also in Vichy. Well, she's in Moulin, and then she's in Vichy. And, and there's gaps between all this. And we don't know the exact dates of everything either. Part of the problem with Coco lying about her past is that earlier part that she covered up, a lot of the dates are, it's hard to pinpoint them exactly. So after Vichy, we know for sure she was in Paris January 1st, 1910, because she signed the ledger book of Chanel Mode, which was the first time that Coco sold her hats in the apartment of her then lover, Etienne Balsan. Of course, Boy Capel was her lover at that time too, with their little love triangle. And then from there, we know that she was traveling around France to Deauville and Biarritz, and then that she was running the Biarritz store, which to me was another sign that she wasn't, flighty or stupid at all, because she was running the Biarritz store. And that was Coco's most successful boutique at that time, with over 100 employees, and the clientele were all, wealthy women aristocrats, titled women, exiled Russians, that kind of thing. And so that was something that she did. And again, I think she didn't really get proper credit for, she's kind of an unsung heroine in all of this. And then we know that she married her Canadian airman, Oscar Fleming, just after World War I, and moved to Canada, which was a huge change in her life. And so to fill in the details on all of this, I researched a lot. I researched the French census records first, because I wanted to figure out where exactly she was, at what years and that kind of thing. And so I looked at as much of that as I could. I did find her in Vichy, and she was living over a hat shop right at the time. The biographer said she was there, but they never said anything about a hat shop. And the census records they're all online. The French ones are, and they're all, unfortunately, they're not searchable. You can't just type in Antoinette Chanel. They're all scanned from the original pages of, the books that the census takers would walk around door to door and use their beautiful handwriting. It's extremely beautiful to look at and pretty hard to understand in some cases. But I poured through those. I even found Coco was in one, living with Etienne Balsan. So I guess the census taker came by the chateau and said, "Who lives here?" And they put down her name, and she was single. And so that's kind of funny. I also looked at the French newspapers at the time, and I thought I would find information about Coco and Antoinette, but I didn't find. I really didn't find anything at all. And then after being frustrated, I finally realized that I was looking at that from the point of view of, modern thinking and how we think of Coco now. But at the time, before 1921, she was just a tradesperson. She was not someone that would be in the society pages at all. And in fact, the society ladies would come to the boutique and talk to Coco and Antoinette, but then in the outside world, they would ignore them and pretend, they didn't know who they were walking down the street. So I came up empty, but not finding anything about them in the papers kind of told me something in its own way. And then I also found in the papers, the only references to Antoinette that I could find were these travel notices that were in the back of the newspaper. Very hard, tiny, tiny print. You would only be looking at them if you were looking for them. And it would say to Paris, and then it would list some names, and to Deauville, to Biarritz, to Monte Carlo. And her name kept turning up in that. And I couldn't figure out for the longest time why her name was there. I didn't recognize any of the other names that were in this, and it would probably be like 8 or 9 names. And then I finally figured out that this was her letting clientele know where she was going to be and which of the boutiques she was going to be at. And they didn't have one in Monte Carlo at the time, but I guess she went down to Monte Carlo to see some of their clients there. So to me, that was another sign that she was more than just this, silly, hardworking sister. She was actually someone that the clients trusted and sought out. I never saw Coco's name, for instance, in these notices and where she would be. So little things like this really helped me to take those and then extrapolate from them, who Antoinette really was to the best of my abilities. Then when World War I ends and she marries Oscar, Oscar's a Canadian, and so one of Oscar's nephews, who still lives in Canada now, I ran across him on some genealogical boards, and he was researching Antoinette. And so we got together, not in person, but he sent me a lot of the research that he had done and some personal anecdotes. And then his cousin, Oscar got married again after Antoinette. and they had a daughter. And so I also spoke to Oscar's daughter, and she, had some good information. She had photographs of there's a tea set that Coco gave Antoinette for her wedding as a gift, and a bedspread that they still have in the family. No one knows what happened to the trunk of clothes that Antoinette brought with her to Canada, unfortunately. I can't even remember, but she brought like 20 something pieces of luggage with her, with a lot of the Chanel clothes to sell, hopefully. But they don't know what happened to those. Oscar died when Mary, his daughter, was young. He died of lung cancer. And so she didn't really get to know him that well and never had a chance to ask him about Antoinette. And then it was something her mother did not like to talk about at all. So she never discussed it with her mother because that was not a happy topic, evidently, for the mother. So that was another really good source of information for that later part of Antoinette's life. And then Antoinette does show up in the Canadian newspapers. Oscar's family was sort of a social Canadian society type family on a smaller level. I mean, they would show up in the local newspapers as, having attended the tennis tournament and hosting people at their country home, that kind of thing. So Antoinette, there was a wedding announcement for her and Oscar. And then, of course, Antoinette, the last thing we know about her is her death certificate in Buenos Aires. And that is really a big mystery. Nobody knows why she went to Buenos Aires. She could have gone back to Paris, but she chose Buenos Aires instead, which to me, I thought that must mean she had a love interest in Buenos Aires. And so that was the genesis of the character Lucho, who is one of the few people in the book who's not based on a real person. When Antoinette married Oscar, she was in her 30s. And so I figured, being an attractive French woman, she must have had, a love life before she married Oscar, but there was no information at all about that. And so knowing that Coco was in a polo crowd, those were a lot of the people that she hung out with. And so I assumed Antoinette would have done the same. And a lot of the South Americans also were part of that crowd. Etienne used to go to South America quite a bit. So it just made sense to me that she could have had a lover, someone in Buenos Aires that she had known from before the time that she married Oscar. There's mystery about her death too. Some people say, I think Coco lied about that too and told people that it was the yellow fever. Some people said suicide. The death certificate actually says intoxication, although it's the Spanish form. So it says intoxicación. I don't speak Spanish, so that's the best I can do. But so some of the biographers say she died of alcohol poisoning. So I literally started writing the book making her drink a lot because I was like, well, gosh, she died of alcohol poisoning. So I have to have her, sneaking into the nuns, stash of wine for the priests and all that. And but then something about that just didn't seem right. Like, Coco, there's never any stories about her drinking too much. I mean, I know she drank champagne, but I don't think she ever, there's none of that I could find in the family. So I asked a man in Buenos Aires who had gotten me the death certificate. And I said, what does this word mean to you? Because I think to us English speakers, we think, she was drunk. And he said that he thought it meant food poisoning. So that shocked me. I was like, food poisoning? And nobody, none of the biographers have said that. So then I just thought, well, poisoning makes sense. It could have been food poisoning, but it also, a lot of people at that time, a lot of the sleeping drugs that they gave people had heroin in them and cocaine. And that was, you could buy that kind of stuff over the counter because people didn't know how powerful it was. So it wasn't uncommon for people to die having taken too much of something like that. And so that's how that came about. with Antoinette, despite all the mystery. I know that Oscar's daughter had gone to Buenos Aires to try to see if she could get more information, but she did not. So that is really all that is known about that. I think another thing, another reason I wanted to write the book and that I learned as I was writing was just how much the convent orphanage influenced her life. Later, there's kind of the obvious, like the clothing that she designed and how much she loved black and white, and the nubby sort of peasanty fabrics that people didn't wear until she came around. Her chain link belts you can look at pictures of the nuns from those days and they look exactly like the chain link rosaries that they wore around their waists. The modesty of her clothing, it was always very modest. She wasn't one to show, gratuitous skin. I know later in life, she hated the mini skirt. She just thought it was the most horrible thing ever. And then the concept of a uniform, she really came up with this, the Chanel suit, and the idea that you just put on what you're going to wear and you don't have to think about it. You dress to live, you don't live to dress. Because once she got out of the convent, she was ready to go. She was ready to live and do things and not fuss with what she was wearing. And which started, with Etienne, and she's living in his country house with him. And she doesn't really have a wardrobe. She has no money. He only cares about horses. So, he's not taking her on buying trips to Paris or anything like that. So she borrows his clothes and she goes to his closet and starts taking his sweaters and cutting them up the middle and putting ribbons and buttonholes and buttons on them. She learned to ride with Etienne and wore his clothing, wore pants to ride in. And then she went to a tailor there in the small village where his chateau was, and asked the tailor to make her own riding outfit that was just like a man's. And evidently the tailor did not want to do that, but she forced him to do it. So she learned, this is my hypothesis, but I think, once you take off the corset and the dress, the skirts and all that, and you put on a pair of pants and a comfortable sweater, I don't know how you're going to go back to the uncomfortable stuff. So I think she realized, I can move better in this. And she was also big on pockets. Like, she was one of the first people to put pockets on her clothing, because men had pockets and women did not. In fact, I think we still need more pockets for our phones, but I would like to push for that. But she really, her whole, the hats, she started with the hats. Those caught on because the hats at the time were the huge concoctions of, flowers and birds and fruit. And it was almost impossible for a woman to walk with those hats on. They had a gazillion hat pins sticking into their scalps. And so she went with the simple hats, the straw boaters with just a ribbon or a feather, which were much more easy to get around in. And people admired those and started asking her where she got them and if she would make them for them. And so she did. And then she would go, once she was in Paris and making the hats, and then with Bois Capel, she started going to Deauville, the resort town. And again, she wanted to live. She wanted to walk along the beach on the promenade and to actually be able to move. And she wanted to play tennis, and she learned how to do that. She learned how to play golf. And so that was how her clothing really came about, was because she made clothing for herself that she could move in, as opposed to the clothing that was for women at the time. In fact, I think it's funny, there's a picture of her taking a break from tennis. She's with a man, and of course the tennis outfit she has on is so fancy for us now, but back then it was considered casual. But it's funny because she's smoking a cigarette. So I think it's so funny, on her tennis break, she's got the cigarette going. But then then World War I came. And so the clothing that she made for women to be able to move around in was the perfect timing for that. And in the book, there's a scene where she's in Deauville, and a lot of the wealthy women want to volunteer at the hospital, but the doctors say you cannot wear that here. You know, the clothing you have on was probably a fire hazard. They said there's some old uniforms, old nurses' uniforms in this cupboard, and you have to wear these. And they were horrified. So they took them to Coco to have her, you know, do them up properly. And that was what they wore. So she was really, for her fashion sense, it was the right time and the right place. And she got rich during World War I, which is kind of funny to think of, partly too, because she was willing, again, kind of with a peasant's common sense, practicality, and a combination of a peasant's and a nun's. You know, she was really good at working with what was available. So jersey, a fabric that had been used for men's underthings, that was available. And so she bought it up, and nobody else had used that, and turned it into women's suits and dresses. And those became very popular. And she had women wearing rabbit fur because the chinchilla furs were not available. And, you know, the rabbit fur was what the peasants would wear. But she somehow, you know, I think because she was such a good seamstress in part and had such a good eye for everything, and especially fit, she would convince the wealthy ladies to spend $1 gazillion on the rabbit fur. So again, that's another reflection of how her early days, I think, played into her later days. And in fact, when this is outside the scope of the book, but when she was older, about 1930, she built a home in the south of France called La Pausa as her, you know, kind of retreat. And she mimicked a lot of the convent in Auvazine for this home. She had the architect go to the convent in Auvazine and look at the staircase in the main hall, and then replicate that staircase in her vacation home. And some other things, like the archways were the same, but she didn't tell anybody. You know, she still didn't tell anybody that she grew up in that convent orphanage. But then she entertained in this home that had these features from the orphanage, and then she also entertained in a way that was not what everybody else was doing. She had like a buffet style meals, and the furniture was all kind of more primitive than, you know, what we think of as French, the fancy Louis the this and Louis the that and gilt. It was a much simpler place that really harkened back to her youth with the nuns. Which I think she realized, you know, that if it wasn't for the nuns in the convent, that they really saved her, that she probably would have ended up like her mother if she had not been taken in by them and learned a skill and learned how to work hard. And she and Antoinette, by living at that convent orphanage, whether they ever realized it or not, they were basically living within a women-run business, with the mother abbess as the CEO, and, you know, different levels of women organizing and running things that in some way must have, I think, you know, seeped into their subconscious, so that when they were running their own business, you know, they had some idea of how to do that and how to act. So that's another reason why the book, I don't know, I thought it was really important to start with her early life, the part that most people don't know about. And that a lot of that is why, and I wanted to tell it through Antoinette's point of view, because Coco was, you know, such a liar, and Antoinette could actually tell the truth. And then I also thought Antoinette had a really good story herself, and I thought that she should be given some credit for all that she did, since nobody knows who she is now at all. I think, you know, Chanel, they name like their cosmetics and perfumes after different parts of Coco's past. And I think Antoinette has like a lipstick or something. I think she deserves a perfume, but I think right now all she really has is like a lipstick color, or maybe an eyeshadow. But I'm not quite sure. I know there's no perfume. But I mean, if y'all have any questions, I'm happy to answer anything, or I could even, I mean, I could like literally, you don't want me to, because I could go on and talk more about all the things I think are so interesting about Coco.
Mary, you need to unmute. Mary, unmute.
Okay, I got
There
you.
you go.
I got you. What can you tell us about Adrian after the story ends, her life?
Adrian,
Mm-hmm.
I found Adrian to be so fascinating too. You know, that she was determined to marry, you know, someone she was in love with and someone who was, you know, a gentleman. And she did. They did get married.
Well, it did.
They did. And it's also amazing that, you know, he married her too. Usually men of his class did not do that. They would get married to someone else and then keep, you know, the person they might have actually loved as a mistress. But so they were together decades, waiting for his parents to die before they got married.
Right.
And so they did get married, no children. So Oscar's nephew sent me a photograph of a painting of Antoinette. And so in the book, there's a part where Tadej Stajka paints a portrait of Antoinette that she is going to give to Lucio. And so there really is a portrait of her that was painted by Tadej Stajka. And but I don't have permission to use it, which is killing me. And I had because she looks so beautiful in it and just so happy. And but I reached out to try to get permission from Adrian's family. They are the ones who I think still have it, is what I've been told. And that didn't really go well. So I can't use that photo. But she was a very, you know, private person. She never gave away Coco's secrets, you know, never told anybody. She knew the whole truth about Coco. She, you know, lived happily ever after with her handsome prince at their chateau in a town called Nexen in France.
Great. Great. I also thought it was pretty amazing that none of the girls got pregnant except for the oldest sister.
Yeah.
You know, back in those days, you know, birth control non-existent pretty much. But yeah.
Yeah, I thought so too. But, you know, some people say that Andre was actually Coco's son instead of Julia Barrett's son, and that he was her son with Etienne. But nobody really knows that for sure, and it's speculative. Yeah. So I stuck with that it's her nephew.
Good idea.
But other than that, there's I don't know if they I don't know. Maybe they didn't after their own childhood. I don't know. Yeah, because Antoinette didn't have kids. Adrian did not.
Yeah, I know. Okay. They must know something we don't.
Yeah, I don't know.
Anyway.
Rosemary, did you have a question? You have to unmute yourself.
I was going to ask about Andre and what happened to him in the future after the book.
Andre, Coco outlived him. He died during the war, during World War II. He was taken prisoner and he was ill in the prison camp. It affected his health in the German prison camp. And so he never really totally recovered. I think he had poor health from then on. And so he died. He got married and had children, but he did die before Coco did. You know, Coco basically outlived everybody. She outlived her family. She outlived her friends. I think, you know, as she got older, she became a kind of a bitter person, very lonely person. She never really found the love that she was looking for. I think Boy Capel was the one true love of her life, and of course he died tragically. And then she had a multi-year affair with a Russian duke, who I think she probably hoped he would marry her, but he didn't. And then she was the mistress lover of the Duke of Westminster, who was the richest man in England at the time. They were together for about 10 years, which is interesting too, because she still kept working that whole time. Her work was very important to her, and something she was never going to give up. So even though, she was with the richest man in England, she would leave and go back to Paris for her job. And she even said, someone asked her, if she was going to marry him, and she said, there can be many duchesses of Westminster, but there can only be one Coco Chanel. And that was her way of saying no. But I also think, he supposedly wanted an heir. And by this time she was in her mid 40s or so, and she supposedly was trying to get pregnant and could not. And then they ended up breaking up, and he married someone else, like literally almost right away, a younger woman. And then after that, she was actually engaged to another man, although he didn't seem like a great guy, but she was engaged to him. And then he came to her house in the south of France, where she had a tennis court, and they were playing tennis, and he told her he was tired and he didn't want to play anymore. And she said, oh, come on, don't quit. And then he had a heart attack and died on the tennis court.
Wow.
And so then after that, I think her next lover was, she picked for that one a German, Nazi officer during World War II. So, which was is a huge scandal in her life. And so she never got married, and never really found that one person, and outlived everybody, including Andre. Andre had a daughter whose name was Gabrielle, who did outlive Coco, and although she's passed away now.
So what did Coco Chanel say about the Nazi guy? Did she ever discuss that period in her life?
I don't think so. I didn't, because my novel ends in 1921, I haven't really researched that part of her life in depth. She lived at the Ritz, and then when the Germans invaded, they set themselves up at the Ritz, and she did not move out of the Ritz or anything like that. And then she did have an affair many years. And it's funny too, because she was in her 60s, and this man was like 20 years younger than her. And,
wow.
And she was, they were lovers, like they were boyfriend and girlfriend. And some people say that, she did it because Andre was in a prison camp and she was trying to get him out. Some people say she was just evil. I think it might be a mixture of both. She was a survivor and she was also an opportunist. But she moved away for a long time. So when World War II came, she shut down her shop, which people were mad about that too, because a lot of the French designers did stay in business, but she basically fired everybody and closed down and said, it's not a time for fashion. And then when the war ended, she lived in Switzerland for many years and did not come back to France, I think in part because a lot of people didn't want her back in France. But then in the 1950s, she finally, that was when she decided to make her comeback, and she opened up Chanel again and started putting out her fashion lines again. But so she kind of had like a cooling off period, I guess you could call it, after World War II. She did, when Paris was liberated, she did open her store. I think they were still selling the perfume, and she let American servicemen take the Chanel No. 5 for free, and so men were lining up around the block, and everybody said that was one of the reasons why she didn't get hauled off to jail, is because they were all so happy they could take their wives back in America, Chanel No. 5.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I have a question about, you mentioned the book, The Lives of Saints, and that was a book that was in my house as a kid, and I was really fascinated with it. And what made you come up with that idea, or do you have, when you chose that book for them to talk about a little bit in the orphanage?
I can't remember if I read that they actually read that book. I imagine they did. I mean, I grew up Catholic, and my parents, my grandparents, Catholic, and so I mean, I don't know, the saints have always kind of fascinated me because they're so scary. Like everything is so, like, do we really have to do all that to go to heaven? I don't know. So I've always found the lives of the saints, especially from a child's perspective, to be kind of terrifying, in a way. But that's just the church, and that's what it is and what they teach. I mean, not a comment, but I always think it's weird in church, you have the crucifix. I mean, it's the crucifix, but if you really think about it, it's not, the nicest thing to look at from the point of view of what it actually is, which is a man nailed to the cross. So I don't know, I just am kind of fascinated with a lot of the Catholic, the way Catholicism, especially early Catholicism, was. I went to Catholic school for a while, but that was after nuns were teaching. My parents they had nuns, and some of the pictures are hilarious with the nuns with their huge headgear, whatever you would call that. I can't think of it now.
Habit.
Habit.
But so for writing Julia Barrett, Coco actually said that she committed suicide by rolling naked in the snow. And I thought that was like the weirdest, like where do you come up with that? And I wasn't quite sure what to do with that because I didn't have any evidence of how Julia Barrett died. But as I was looking through the old records, I ended up finding her death certificate. She died in Paris in May, which there was no snow in Paris in May. So this was another one of Coco's, tall tales that that Julia Barrett had died that way. And so I was trying to think of, where would that have come from? And it kind of brought me back to the lives of the saints and how, they did these things to make themselves, to try to get rid of impure thoughts. And there was a saint who rolled in the snow naked and that kind of thing to rid himself of impure thoughts. And so that was my justification, or trying to make sense of what Coco said about Julia Barrett's death. And so I thought, well, maybe she did roll in the snow naked, but she didn't die from it right away because she died in Paris in May. So yeah.
That's clever. Okay. So do you speak French? You read French?
I can read it. I studied in France, and
Okay.
when I was there that everybody, first of all, would speak to me in English. It was almost impossible to get anybody to speak to me in French. But I did have to read it, and I did have to write it. That was a long time ago, so I'm very, very rusty. I keep wishing I could learn it again. But when I was there, when I went to Paris, the first day I went, I needed to get a hotel room. And this was like, I don't know how long I had been there. And I walk into the hotel and I said, in my, college French, je voudrais une chambre. And then the man at the desk just sneered at me and he said, let's speak in English. It'll be easier for you and me. I was like intimidated for the rest of my.
Oh, I was just asking that because you'd done all that research and having to go through things, go search for things in the French language would be very difficult if your language. So it must be pretty good, unless they translated it for you.
It's okay. It's okay. It's not great. I would look things up from, like, oh, what's that word? I don't know what that word is.
A lot of work. Oh my God.
And there are, you can find on YouTube some interviews of Coco Chanel, when she was older. And I've watched those and I cannot understand a word she is saying. I mean, she talks so fast, and they also don't have subtitles or anything. They're not translated, which is kind of frustrating. But someday I would really I'd like to, they say that some people, you can get hit on the head and then wake up and you speak 5 languages. That would be nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question. You said that, of course, you've done a lot of research. How much time do you spend researching, like, for instance, this book?
This book took me about 4 years to write total. It was pretty good because my first one took me 10 years to write. But I love to research, and I could research all day long. So, which is good and bad, because it's also a great way to procrastinate as a writer, because of writing, you can just research and research. And so I guess the good thing about Antoinette is that I came up to so many dead ends that I was forced to write. I'm kind of weird that way. I love historical fiction, but I think what I love about it is I don't really like to make anything up. So to the extent I don't have to make anything up, I'm happy. Meaning the facts of their lives, the conversations and all that. Well, even if I could come up, with the actual conversations, that would be great. But I like to draw as much as I can from what has actually happened in their lives. I don't want to guess. With Antoinette, I did have to guess, but what I tried to do was to take everything I knew about her, and I made it so that, some authors switch things around, like they'll switch dates of events or the age of the person, which will not be historically accurate, but it's for the good of the story. And maybe I should have done that in some parts, but I didn't, because I wanted everything in the book that I had to come up with myself to actually have been able to happen. So, there's no reason there could not have been a Lucio. I didn't change any facts of anything that we know about Antoinette. I mean, was there a Lucio? I don't know, but there could have been a Lucio. So that was kind of one of my goals.
About the number of horses that were killed, was that accurate? Was that accurate history?
That
I
was,
forgot the number now, but it was absurdly large.
yeah, like 1 million something. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was, I know it's stunning. But it is accurate. It's very sad. Yeah.
And what about a sequel?
What
Will
about,
there be a sequel? A sequel
Kind of.
to
kind of,
Coco's name? Laughing.
I'm writing, so I'm working on my 3rd novel, and I'm pretty not far along at all. But so this one will be in the 20s and 30s in Paris. And it will still have Coco in it, but she is not the narrator. Instead, the narrator is, if at the end of the Chanel sisters, there's some reference to Misia, her friend Misia. And so that was a real woman, Misia Sert, who was Coco's best friend for, decades. So I think it's funny because you don't really think of Coco as having a best friend, but she really did. And these two ran around causing a lot of trouble, but they were always there for each other. They both had a lot of man problems, and they were always there. This friend picked Coco up each time she needed to be picked up after something bad had happened with one of her boyfriends. And then Coco did the same for her. They traveled to Hollywood together. And she was actually more famous than Coco. She was known as the Queen of Paris. Nobody knows who she is now, but she was the model, one of the models for Toulouse-Lautrec. So she's in a lot of those posters, those old posters. And she was by Renoir many times. And she actually picked up Coco before Coco was famous and brought her into her group of artists, and the ballet that Coco was involved in. That was really Misia's world. And then eventually Coco surpassed Misia in fame and fortune. And now nobody really has heard of Misia.
Sounds interesting.
Yes.
It's very
Look
interesting.
forward to it.
Mhm.
Look
Yeah,
forward to that.
Thank you. Well, it's going to be a while unless a miracle. I'm trying. I'm trying to make myself write faster, but that's the challenge. Definitely.
Well, does anyone have any more questions? Jonathan, do you have anything you want to ask?
Yeah, Judith, this is your second novel and your second time to be part of this crazy Pulpwood Queens nation of ours. So I wonder if you might speak a little bit about what that experience has been like for you to be selected by Kathy Murphy and to be championed and embraced by the Pulpwood Queens.
Great question.
That's such a good question. I mean, that was huge, huge. And I really think if it wasn't for Kathy and the Pulpwood Queens picking up my first book, Wycliffe Hall, I don't even know if there would have been a Chanel Sisters. Because it's so hard as a writer. You know, my first book was published by a small publisher, and which, you know, increases the challenge even more. And I don't even know if I would have felt like anybody had even read it if I hadn't been part of Pulpwood Queens and meeting so many people who, you know, I'm still friends with today, from other authors to other readers, and you know, some of the book clubs here in Houston. And I can even look at my sales, you know, on Amazon, and, you know, there's Pulpwood Queens, and, you know, it goes up all of a sudden. And it was just a big, introducing me to that community made writing not quite as lonely, and just the whole struggle to get people to know you even have a book out there. So I mean, it was really, really a big deal. And it also helped me because I hate, when I went to the first Pulpwood Queens, oh my God, I was so nervous. I hate standing up and talking in front of people. When I heard that Wycliffe Hall was going to be published, and then all of a sudden I had to hire a publicist, and then she's like, well, you need to do this and this. And I was like, wait, what? You mean I have to go and talk to people, like in front of people, strangers, people I don't know? And you can ask Bren McLean, like, I was poor thing, like she didn't even know me, and she's like standing right next to me before I had to go up on the stage the first time, and I'm like, I don't know if I can do this. And she's just looking at me like, you'll be fine.
She's a sweetie.
Yeah, no, she's so funny and nice. But yeah, so I think it was good because by the time the Chanel Sisters came out, I got over all that. Like, you know, now I'm used to it. Now I'm used to, I mean, the Zoom is one thing, but back when we could go in person, I mean, walking into the house of a stranger with all these ladies, and I don't know any of them, and then having to talk about my book in person. And I mean, that was, I don't know, that was hard for me at first, although now I'm fine with it, but I needed a lot of time to get over that. So I think it's good that everything happened the way that it did. And public is a huge part of it. So thank you.
Really, really glad that you are here, and can't wait for your next book. And that would be what? Not 10 years, not 4 years.
I know I'm cutting it down. I'm hoping 3 years. Well, and then the other thing is, you know, once you finish it, it takes so long to get published. The publisher wants a year at least before they'll release it. So with that in mind, it just seems like it's probably going to be, we'll probably all be, you know, vacationing in Mars, with Elon Musk by the time the next book comes out. I don't know. Who knows what'll happen. But I'm working on, I'm trying to like set, like now I have a new method of setting my timer on my phone for like an hour. And then I'm like, I'm not allowed to get up, not allowed to check other emails, not allowed to do anything. I have to write for an hour. That's been helping.
Good luck. Well, I want to thank you, and I want to thank everyone else for coming tonight too. I wish you all the best, and maybe next year at this time we will be having in-house visits or Pat Conroy meetings at the Pat Conroy Center for our Pulpwood Queens, and we'll be seeing you in the future, Judith.
Well, thank you. Thank you all so much for having me. And I've never been there. I would love to be there in person sometime. And I know it's beautiful. I've heard a lot about it. But anyway, thank you all. I will.
Thank you.
sign
Thank
it.
you. It was a
Thank you.
wonderful book.
Thank
Enjoyed
you.
your book.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you,
Bye, guys.
everyone. We'll see you next month.
Take
Bye,
care.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye, Karen.